Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab. Now, let's begin. The January wind cut through Grant Cole's jacket as he stood at the edge of the freshly turned earth. His hands hung at his sides, numb from more than just the cold. 18 years old. Ashley had been 18 years old. The coffin had been so small, so impossibly light when he'd helped carry it. Around him, mourners were dispersing. Hushed condolences faded into the gray afternoon. Grant heard none of it. He stared at the brass plate bearing his daughter's name, trying to reconcile the metal letters with the laughing girl who'd sat across from him at breakfast just 5 days ago. 5 days. That's all it had taken for his world to collapse. His phone buzzed. Grant ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. On the fourth vibration, he finally pulled it from his pocket, his jaw tight with irritation at the intrusion. Scott Reyes. Grant's brother-in-law. Ashley's uncle. The detective who'd been handling Ashley's case, if you could call an accidental drowning a case. Scott had been sympathetic but firm. Ashley had gone swimming alone in the Quarry Lake outside town, gotten caught in the current, drowned. It happened. A terrible accident. Grant's ex-wife Paige Cooper had collapsed when they told her. Grant had just gone cold inside. He almost declined the call, but something made him answer. Grant. Scott's voice was urgent, clipped, different from the measured, sorrowful tone he'd used for the past 5 days. I found something about Ashley. Come to my office right now. Grant's heart stuttered. What kind of? Not on the phone. And don't tell anyone. Come alone. The line went dead. Grant stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. The mourners were gone now. The groundskeepers waited at a respectful distance, ready to finish filling in the grave. He looked down at the coffin one more time, then turned and walked toward his truck. The drive to the police station took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of Grant's mind spinning through possibilities. Had they made a mistake? Had someone else been involved? The medical examiner had been certain drowning. No signs of foul play, blood alcohol level suggesting she'd been drinking. Ashley, who rarely touched alcohol because she was training for a marathon. Ashley, who was afraid of deep water after nearly drowning as a child. None of it had made sense. But grief had dulled Grant's instincts, made him accept what he was told because the alternative that someone had hurt his daughter was too terrible to confront. Now, those instincts roared back to life. Grant pulled into the station parking lot. The building was quiet, most of the staff gone for the day. He pushed through the front door and started toward Scott's office on the second floor. Then he saw who was standing outside Scott's door, and his legs stopped working. Ashley. His daughter. His dead daughter, buried less than an hour ago. She stood in the hallway, wearing jeans and a hoodie he recognized. Her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was crying, her hands wrapped around her middle like she was trying to hold herself together. Grant's vision tunneled. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright. He grabbed the wall for support. Dad! Her voice broke on the word. Then Scott appeared in the doorway behind her, his face grim, and reality crashed back. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't a miracle. This was something else entirely. Get in here, Scott said quietly. Both of you. Grant's legs moved on autopilot. He stepped into Scott's office, his eyes never leaving the girl who looked exactly like his daughter. She sat in one of the chairs, her face buried in her hands. Scott closed the door and locked it. That's not. Grant's voice came out strangled. Who is that? Her name is Amanda Glover, Scott said. She's Ashley's twin sister. The words made no sense. Grant shook his head. That's impossible. Ashley doesn't have a twin. We don't have another. Paige gave her up for adoption 18 years ago, Scott interrupted. Right after she was born. Closed adoption. She never told you. Grant sank into the other chair. The room tilted. Paige wouldn't. She did. Scott pulled out a file, slapped it on the desk. Amanda showed up at the station 3 days ago with her adoption papers and a DNA test she'd done through one of those ancestry websites. She'd been searching for her birth family. Found Ashley first through social media. They'd been talking for 2 weeks. Amanda lifted her head. Her eyes, Ashley's eyes were red and swollen. We were supposed to meet, that night, at the quarry. Grant's blood turned to ice. What? I was late, Amanda whispered. My car broke down on the highway. By the time I got there, she choked on a sob. The police were already there. I saw them pulling her out of the water. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I'd get blamed, if they'd think I did something. So I ran. She came to me yesterday, Scott said. Said she couldn't stay quiet anymore. Said there was something wrong with the whole thing. He opened the file. And she was right. Grant forced himself to focus on the documents Scott was spreading across the desk. Photos. Reports. A phone log. Ashley didn't drown, Scott said flatly. Or at least, not the way we thought. He pulled out a photo of Ashley's neck. Grant had seen his daughter at the morgue, had identified her body, but he'd been too shattered to notice details. Now Scott pointed to faint marks on her throat, almost invisible against the mottled discoloration from the water. Bruising, Scott said, consistent with manual strangulation. The ME missed it initially because of the condition of the body after being in the water. But when I went back this morning and pushed him to look closer, he pulled out another document. Someone held her under. This was murder. The word hit Grant like a physical blow. Murder. Someone had killed Ashley deliberately. While Amanda sat in a broken-down car on the highway, someone had strangled Grant's daughter and held her under the water until she drowned. Who? Grant's voice was barely human. Who did this? Scott's jaw tightened. That's where it gets complicated. He pulled out a phone log. Ashley's cell records. She made 3 calls that night. One to Amanda at 8:47, telling her she was at the quarry. One to me at 9:03. Scott's expression darkened. And one to Patrick Kent at 9:15. Patrick Kent. Grant knew that name. Patrick was Scott's partner, a detective in the narcotics division. Ashley had known him since she was a kid. Scott and Patrick had been friends for years, practically family. Patrick told me he never got that call. Scott continued. Said his phone was off. But the call log shows they talked for 4 minutes. And there's more. He pulled out surveillance photos, grainy but clear enough. Patrick was seen at a gas station 2 miles from the quarry at 9:45 that night, cleaning mud off his clothes. Quarry mud. Grant's mind was racing now, the photographer's eye for detail taking over. Why? Why would Patrick hurt Ashley? Because she saw something she shouldn't have. Scott pulled out one final document. 3 weeks ago, Ashley was doing a photo essay for her college journalism class. Urban decay, abandoned buildings. She took this. The photo showed an old warehouse. Through a dirty window, barely visible, were 2 figures. One of them was clearly Patrick Kent. The other was a man Grant didn't recognize, but the bricks of something wrapped in plastic on the table between them told the story clearly enough. Drugs, Grant said. A lot of drugs, Scott confirmed. Patrick's been on narcotics for 5 years. I think he's been on the take for most of it. Ashley must have shown him the photo. Maybe asked him about it. Maybe she was even naive enough to think there was a good explanation. His voice hardened. And Patrick killed her for it. Amanda was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face. Grant looked at her, this daughter he'd never known existed, grieving for the sister she'd barely met. Then, he looked at the evidence spread across Scott's desk. Why are you showing me this? Grant asked quietly. Why not just arrest him? Scott leaned back in his chair. Because Patrick's not working alone. I've been digging since Amanda came to me. There are at least 3 other cops involved in whatever he's running. Maybe more. I don't know who I can trust. He met Grant's eyes. And even if I did, the evidence I have is thin. A photo Ashley took isn't enough. The bruises could be explained away. The phone call, the gas station appearance, all circumstantial. A good lawyer would tear it apart. So, he gets away with it. Grant's voice was flat. I didn't say that. Scott leaned forward. I said the legal system might not be enough. But I thought you should know the truth. What you do with it. He shrugged. That's up to you. The office fell silent. Grant looked at the photos again. His daughter's body. The marks on her throat. Patrick Kent's face. He'd spent 15 years as a documentary filmmaker before Ashley was born, tracking stories through war zones and disaster areas, getting footage others couldn't. He knew how to watch, how to wait, how to plan. He'd given it up when Ashley came along, switched to safer work photographing wildlife and nature, became a different person. A father. Now his daughter was dead, murdered by someone they'd trusted, someone who thought he'd gotten away with it. Grant stood. Where does Patrick live? Scott wrote down an address. Grant, if you do something, you showed me evidence. Grant interrupted. That's all that happened here. You did your job. He looked at Amanda. She'll need somewhere safe to stay. Whoever killed Ashley might come after her too. She's staying with me, Scott said. I'll keep her safe. Grant nodded. He took the address and walked to the door. Then he paused. That photo Ashley took. Do you still have it? The original file. Scott pulled a USB drive from his desk drawer. Everything's on here, including some other things I've found. Bank records that don't quite add up, surveillance footage, witness statements that didn't make it into official reports. He handed it over. In case you need it. Grant pocketed the drive. He took one last look at Amanda, his daughter who was and wasn't this ghost of Ashley who'd survived. I'm sorry, he told her. I'm sorry you lost her. And I'm sorry for what's going to happen next. Then he left. Grant didn't go home. He drove to a storage unit on the edge of town, one he'd kept since his documentary days. Inside were boxes of old equipment, cameras, recording devices, body armor from when he'd filmed in combat zones, and other things. A journalist in a war zone learned to protect themselves. He pulled out a locked case, keyed in the combination, and opened it. The Glock 19 inside was clean and oiled, maintained even though he hadn't fired it in years. Grant checked the magazine, then set it aside. Not yet. He needed information first. Planning. He pulled out his laptop and loaded the USB drive Scott had given him. Spent the next 3 hours going through everything. Bank records showing deposits Patrick couldn't explain. Surveillance footage from various locations around town, timestamps, and faces. Witness statements about a narcotics ring that had been operating for years. And at the center of it all, Patrick Kent. But Scott was right, it wasn't enough. Not for court. These were breadcrumbs, suggestions, implications. Nothing concrete enough to convict. The photo Ashley had taken was the closest thing to solid evidence, and even that just showed Patrick in a warehouse with another man. His lawyers would tear it apart. The legal system had failed before Grant even tried to use it. So he wouldn't use it. Grant opened a new document and started typing. Locations, times, patterns. Patrick's schedule, his routes, his habits. The names of the other cops Scott suspected. Everything Scott had gathered. Everything Grant could find online. Everything he could remember from years of knowing Patrick as a family friend. By midnight, he had the skeleton of a plan. By 3 a.m., he had the details. By dawn, he was ready to start. Grant Cole had spent 15 years telling other people's stories. Now he was going to tell Patrick Kent's, every dark corner of it. And when he was done, Patrick would face a punishment worse than prison. He would face the truth. The first step was confirmation. Grant needed to be absolutely certain, needed to see Patrick's guilt with his own eyes. For 3 days, he followed Patrick's routine, trailed him from his apartment to the police station, from the station to his gym, from the gym to a bar he frequented. Patrick was careful, professional. He never went near the warehouse from Ashley's photo. Never met with anyone suspicious. On the 4th day, Patrick's pattern changed. Grant was parked across from Patrick's apartment building at 11 p.m. when the detective emerged, dressed in street clothes, checking his phone. Patrick got into an unmarked sedan, not his usual car, and drove north out of town. Grant followed at a distance, lights off, using techniques he'd learned filming subjects who didn't want to be filmed. Patrick drove for 30 minutes, taking back roads, clearly checking for tails. But Grant had been doing this longer. He stayed invisible. Patrick ended up at a rural property, a farmhouse surrounded by empty fields. 3 other cars were already there. Grant parked a quarter-mile down the road, grabbed his camera equipment, and moved through the darkness. The farmhouse had lights on in the back. Grant circled around, staying low, until he found a position in the tree line with a clear view through the windows. He set up his camera, a high-end model with a telephoto lens and night vision capability, the kind he'd used to film nocturnal wildlife. Through the lens, he counted 5 men in the farmhouse kitchen. Patrick, 2 he recognized as police officers from the station. 2 he didn't know. On the table between them were bricks of cocaine, stacks of cash, and several handguns. Grant recorded everything. 30 minutes of footage. Faces, voices. He had a directional microphone attached. The drugs, the money, Patrick laughing about something. One of the other cops counting cash. A discussion about distribution routes. Then one of the unknown men said something that made Grant's blood freeze. What about that girl? The man's voice was rough, agitated. The one who took the photo. You sure that's handled? Patrick's expression didn't change. She went for a swim. It's handled. And her family? Devastated dad. Ex-wife in shock. They bought the accident story. We're clear. Patrick poured himself a drink. Even if they hadn't, there's nothing to connect me to it. I was careful. You better have been, another cop said. We can't have any more heat. The operation's too good to risk. Patrick raised his glass. To staying smart and staying rich. They all drank. Grant recorded it. Then he packed up his equipment and disappeared back into the darkness. He had his confirmation. He had evidence that would hold up in court: video, audio, faces, confessions. He could take this to the FBI, to Internal Affairs, to anyone who would listen. Patrick and his crew would go to prison. But that wasn't enough. Not for Ashley. Not for Grant. Prison was mercy. These men had murdered his daughter and toasted to getting away with it. They'd taken her future, her dreams, her life, and they'd laughed about it. Grant had promised Amanda something was going to happen. He'd promised Ashley's memory the same. He was going to keep that promise. Grant spent the next week building his trap. He started with research, digging into each member of Patrick's crew. Their backgrounds, their families, their fears, their weaknesses. Everyone had pressure points. Everyone had something they were afraid to lose. Patrick Kent, divorced, no kids, estranged from his family. His whole identity was tied to his job, his reputation, his perceived success. He drove a BMW he couldn't afford on a cop's salary and lived in a luxury apartment building. He cared about appearance, status, respect. Detective Mike Manning, married with 3 children, deeply religious community ties. His wife ran a charity. His public image was everything. Detective Rod Fisher, gambling problem, in debt to some very bad people. Dirty money was the only thing keeping him afloat. The 2 civilians, Terry Mueller and Virgil Phillips, were distributors with connections to organized crime. Dangerous, but also expendable in the eyes of their bosses if they became liabilities. Grant didn't need to destroy all of them the same way. He needed to turn them against each other. He started with Rod Fisher. Grant had found evidence of Rod's gambling debts in Scott's files: $80,000 owed to a loan shark named Dwight Cowan. Dwight was the kind of man who broke fingers for late payments. Grant visited Dwight at his auto shop, walked in with a briefcase full of cash money he'd withdrawn from his savings. Ashley's college fund that would never be needed now. I need information, Grant told him, about Rod Fisher. Dwight, a bull of a man with scars on his knuckles, eyed the briefcase. What kind of information? How much does he owe you? 80 grand. Plus interest. Grant opened the briefcase. I'll pay his debt. In exchange, I need you to tell Rod that someone's been asking questions about him. Someone from the DA's office. Tell him there's a federal investigation into police corruption, and his name came up. Tell him he's about to be arrested unless he cooperates. Dwight's eyes narrowed. Why? Because I need him scared. And I need him to believe the only way out is to turn on his partners. Dwight counted the money. This covers the debt and buys you 1 phone call. After that, I'm out. 1 call is all I need. Dwight made the call that afternoon. Grant, listening on a clone of Rod's phone that he created using equipment from his storage unit journalists. Trick, if you can clone a phone, you can monitor someone's communications. Heard the whole conversation. Heard the panic in Rod's voice. 2 days later, Rod reached out to Patrick, suggesting they meet. Grant was ready. He'd rented a warehouse across from the one in Ashley's photo, set up surveillance equipment, and waited. When Patrick and Rod arrived, Grant recorded their conversation. Watched Rod's growing desperation. His suggestion that maybe they needed to be smart about the heat. Watched Patrick reassure him that everything was fine, that there was no investigation. But the seed was planted. Grant then moved to Mike Manning. Mike's weakness was his reputation, his family, his role in the community. Grant created a fake email account, posed as a journalist, and sent Mike a message. Detective Manning, I'm working on an investigative piece about corruption in local law enforcement. Your name has come up in connection with drug trafficking. I'd like to give you a chance to provide your side of the story before we go to print. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. Mike didn't respond to the email, but Grant, monitoring his communications, saw Mike frantically calling Patrick. Another meeting. More panic. Grant was isolating them, making each one feel exposed, turning their paranoia against them. Then he moved to Terry Mueller and Virgil Phillips, the civilian distributors. These men were connected to organized crime, which meant they had bosses. Bosses who didn't tolerate weakness or exposure. Grant anonymously tipped off the DEA about the farmhouse operation, providing just enough detail to get their attention, but not enough to identify his source. Then he sat back and watched. The DEA started sniffing around. Terry and Virgil's bosses started asking questions. The whole operation began to fracture. Patrick tried to hold it together. Grant watched him scramble, watched him meet with each member of his crew separately, trying to calm them down. But the fear was spreading. They were turning on each other, questioning each other, wondering who might talk first. Grant had one more move to make. He used Ashley's photo, the original one that had gotten her killed. But he didn't give it to the police. Instead, he anonymously sent copies to the local newspaper, to the FBI field office, to the state attorney general, and to the families of every person Patrick and his crew had ever arrested. The photo alone wouldn't convict anyone. But it would raise questions, lots of questions. Why was a decorated narcotics detective in a warehouse with known criminals? Why had this photo been buried? What else was being buried? The media picked it up. Suddenly, Patrick Kent's name was everywhere. The investigation he'd been promised would never happen was now very real, very public, and very dangerous to everyone involved. Grant watched the structure collapse from the inside. Rod Fisher, terrified of prison and of his gambling debts, cut a deal with federal prosecutors. He gave up everything: names, dates, locations, evidence. The whole operation. Mike Manning's perfect reputation shattered. His wife left him. His church excommunicated him. By the time the FBI arrested him, he was a broken man. Terry Mueller and Virgil Phillips fled town, trying to escape both law enforcement and their own bosses. They didn't get far. The organized crime connections Grant had poked ensured they disappeared permanently. No one would ever find them. And Patrick Kent, the man who'd killed Ashley, who'd laughed about it, who'd thought he was untouchable, faced something worse than prison. He faced everyone knowing exactly what he was. The trial took 6 months. With Rod Fisher's testimony, the physical evidence, and Grant's surveillance footage turned over to the FBI through Scott, the prosecution built an airtight case. Patrick's lawyers fought hard, but there was no defense against the mountain of evidence. The drug trafficking charges alone would have been enough. But then came the murder charge. Scott had continued investigating Ashley's death. With the pressure on Patrick's crew, he'd found more. Testimony from a confidential informant who'd seen Patrick at the quarry that night. DNA evidence from under Ashley's fingernails. Phone records showing Patrick's burner phone near the scene. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Grant sat in the courtroom and watched Patrick's face as the verdict was read. Watched the man who'd killed his daughter realize that his life was over. Watched the deputies handcuff him, lead him away. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. It still wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. But it was something. Outside the courthouse, news crews swarmed. Grant ignored them, walked past the cameras and microphones, just got into his truck. He drove to the cemetery where Ashley was buried, parked, and walked to her grave. The grass had grown over it now. 6 months of grass, 6 months of silence. Grant knelt beside the headstone and traced his daughter's name with his fingers. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. He paid. They all paid. The wind rustled through the trees. Grant closed his eyes and remembered Ashley laughing, Ashley running, Ashley alive. Those memories hurt like broken glass, but they were all he had left. Except he didn't just have memories. He had Amanda. Grant stood and walked back to his truck. He'd been keeping his distance from her, not sure how to navigate the complicated grief of mourning one daughter while meeting another. But maybe it was time to stop hiding. He drove to Scott's house. Amanda answered the door, her face uncertain. "Hi," Grant said. It came out awkward, stiff. He tried again. "I thought maybe we could get coffee. Or dinner. Or..." He trailed off. "I don't know. I'm not good at this." Amanda's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "I'd like that." They went to a diner, sat across from each other in a booth, and talked. Really talked. Amanda told him about her life, her adoptive parents. Good people, she said, people who'd loved her. Her search for her biological family. Her grief over Ashley. Grant told her about Ashley's childhood, her dreams, her laugh, showed her photos on his phone. It wasn't closure. It wasn't healing. But it was a beginning. Over the next months, they built something. Not a replacement for what had been lost. Nothing could replace Ashley. But a connection, a relationship. Amanda started visiting regularly, staying for weekends. She called him Grant at first, but eventually, hesitantly, she called him Dad. Grant taught her about photography. She taught him about resilience, about continuing to move forward even when everything hurt. They grieved together, healed together. A year after Patrick's conviction, Grant and Amanda visited Ashley's grave together. They brought flowers. Amanda had graduated college, was starting a job with a nonprofit. She'd gotten through it. They both had. Do you think she'd have liked me? Amanda asked quietly, looking at the headstone. She already did, Grant said. You were texting for 2 weeks. She was excited to meet you. She told me about you the day before, said she had a surprise for me. Something that would change everything. His voice caught. She was right. They stood there in silence for a long time. Two survivors bound by loss and love, and the memory of a girl who'd been murdered before she could meet her twin sister. When they left, Grant felt something he hadn't felt in a year. Not happiness, he wasn't sure he'd ever feel that again. But peace. The kind that came from knowing that even though the world was broken, and people were cruel, and nothing could ever make things right, he'd done everything he could. He'd gotten justice for Ashley. He protected Amanda. He'd made sure the men who destroyed his family paid for what they'd done. Patrick Kent would spend the rest of his life in a 6x8 cell, surrounded by the kind of criminals he'd once pretended to fight. No status, no respect, no BMW or luxury apartment. Just decades of concrete and bars, and the knowledge that everyone knew exactly what he was. Mike Manning lost everything that mattered to him: his family, his reputation, his place in the community. The man who'd built his identity on being upstanding and moral was now a convicted criminal, his name synonymous with corruption. Rod Fisher, who'd cooperated, still got 10 years. His testimony had saved him from life in prison, but it hadn't saved him from the consequences. His gambling debts were still there, waiting for him when he got out. If he got out, and Terry Mueller and Virgil Phillips had simply vanished, disappeared into whatever dark hole their bosses had thrown them into. Grant had dismantled their entire operation, exposed them, destroyed them, and he'd done it using their own paranoia, their own greed, their own fear. They'd torn each other apart while Grant watched from the shadows, pulling strings, applying pressure, making sure the dominoes fell exactly the way he wanted them to. He was good at telling stories. He just never told one like this before. 2 years later, Grant and Amanda stood in a photography gallery downtown. The walls were covered with images, some Grant's, some Amanda's. They'd put together an exhibition together. Pictures of nature, of light and shadow, of things that were broken and things that were healing. In the center of the main room hung a single portrait. Ashley, taken the week before she died, laughing at something off camera. Her eyes bright, her whole future ahead of her. Underneath the portrait was a plaque. Ashley Cole. Beloved daughter. Gone, but never forgotten. The opening night was crowded. People moved through the gallery, studying the images, talking quietly. Some who'd known Ashley came to pay their respects. Others were just art lovers, drawn by the beauty of the work. Scott showed up, still in his detective's badge, still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. He stood in front of Ashley's portrait for a long time. She would have loved this, he said to Grant. Both of you, creating together, this is what she would have wanted. Grant nodded. We're calling it healing through light. It felt right. Scott smiled sadly. It is. He paused. I got a letter from Patrick last week. From prison. Grant's expression hardened. What did it say? He wanted me to know he was innocent. That Rod Fisher made the whole thing up, that the evidence was planted, that he was framed. Scott shook his head. He still thinks he can convince someone. Still thinks he can get out. He won't, Grant said flatly. No, Scott agreed. He won't. The appeals courts have already rejected his claims twice. He's going to die in there. He met Grant's eyes. You know, I never asked what you did during those weeks after I showed you the evidence. Before everything fell apart for Patrick's crew. Grant said nothing. Scott nodded slowly. That's what I thought. For what it's worth, I'm glad. The system was going to fail. You didn't let it. I did what any father would do, Grant said. Maybe, but most fathers couldn't have done it like you did. The way you turned them against each other, made them destroy themselves. And that took skill. Planning. Scott's voice dropped. I'm not supposed to approve. But I do. They stood in silence for a moment. Two men bound by loss and secrets and a justice that existed outside the law. Then Amanda called from across the gallery, and Grant excused himself, leaving Scott alone with Ashley's portrait. Grant found Amanda talking with a young couple interested in one of her photographs. She'd become an accomplished photographer in her own right, her eye for light and composition natural and strong. When she finished with the couple, she turned to Grant with a smile. "This is good," she said. "Really good. Ashley would be proud." "She'd be proud of you," Grant said. "You survived something terrible. And you kept going." "We both did." Amanda squeezed his hand. "We kept going together." The gallery stayed open late into the night. People came and went, looked at the photographs, talked about art and light and shadow. And in the center of it all, Ashley's portrait smiled down at them. Forever 18, forever laughing, forever loved. When the gallery finally closed and the last guest departed, Grant and Amanda stood alone among the images they created. "Do you think we'll ever stop hurting?" Amanda asked quietly. Grant considered the question. "No," he said honestly, "but I think we'll get better at carrying it. And I think we'll keep creating beautiful things despite it. That's how we honor her." Amanda nodded. They turned off the lights, locked the gallery, and walked out into the cool evening air. Behind them, in the darkness, Ashley's portrait kept smiling. And somewhere in a prison cell, Patrick Kent sat in the ruins of the life he'd built on corruption and violence, realizing too late that when you murder someone's daughter, you don't just destroy a life. You create a reckoning. Grant Cole had been that reckoning. Not a vigilante, not a hero, just a father who'd loved his daughter enough to ensure her killer faced justice in every sense of the word. The legal system had put Patrick in prison, but Grant had put him there, broken, exposed, stripped of everything that mattered to him, surrounded by enemies, facing decades of knowing that his own arrogance and cruelty had brought him down. That was the story Grant had told, the last story he'd ever needed to tell, and it was enough. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.